spiritual growth is often sparked by great love or deep pain. But so much of our world conspires to keep us too busy to feel loved or to pay attention to our deep feelings. We want to grow, but we aren't always aware of the points at which God is inviting us forward. We need mentors and tools that will help slow us down to notice God with us and to see where we may be welcoming the grace of God in our lives and where we may be resisting God's initiative and work. One tool that has helped me immensely over the years is the Enneagram. It's become rather popular in the church in recent years. My guests today, Bill and Kristi Gaultiere, have written an important book that unpacks this tool, Healthy Feelings, Thriving Faith. I really appreciate how they make the Enneagram understandable as a tool for growth. Did you know that you can join a community of fellow listeners to this podcast who are hungry to grow deeper in the unhurried way of Jesus? There's nothing quite like having a group of like-minded friends with whom to share the journey. We call this group Unhurried Leaders, and we meet in a live Zoom each month to talk about various facets of living and leading unhurried. We now have 4 years of archived monthly recordings that can resource your spiritual journey. I would love to have you join this growing online community of men and women. It's one of my most encouraging hours each month. To learn more and to join this group, please visit unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders, all one word. Well, Bill and Kristi, it's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you as my longtime friends about this new book of yours.
Thank you, Alan. We love what you and Jim are doing in Unhurried Living, and really it's an honor to have this time with you and your listeners.
We've gotten to journey with you, learn from you and with you, and it is such a joy to follow Jesus with you and to get to be partners in serving him together as well.
Well, we feel the same way. We admire what God's been doing both in and through you over the years that our paths have been crossing. And you've written a new book, this Healthy Feelings, Thriving Faith, about the Enneagram. And I've really found it helpful as I've been reading. I'd love to start by asking if you would share a little bit about your own introduction to the Enneagram and maybe some ways it's accompanied you in your spiritual journey.
Well, that's a fun story. I was meeting with Jane Willard for spiritual direction. And on about my second meeting with her, she had the Enneagram, A Christian Perspective in her hands. And she said, we had dinner with somebody last night who gave us this book. They said it changed their marriage. Are you familiar with this? Have you heard of this? And I said, I really don't know much about it, but I took note, and she didn't either. So we began to kind of learn together, the two of us. And that's one of the things about Jane. She's so humble. Even though she was my spiritual director, she was kind of, let's learn this together and talk about it together. And then right around the same time, just after that, meeting you and Jim, and the same time you were learning it and diving deep. And as we began to learn it, we began to see how powerful a tool this was for spiritual growth. And then later, as we got more and more proficient with it, Bill and I began to see what a powerful tool it was for emotional growth, first within our own lives, because thankfully, as we learned very early from the Enneagram masters who are influencing us, you work with this tool for at least 5 years personally before you start using it with anybody else. That was wisdom that we are grateful that we got that early on and applied that to our lives. And as we did work with ourselves, the way that it exposed underlying unconscious sin and needs and motivations that were operating was so helpful and also quite exposing. But it was really freeing spiritually, because we can't repent of a sin that we don't even know is operating. So it was so helpful spiritually for me in that. And then it was also a great tool of empathy as I came to understand and be able to see Bill through his Enneagram type, it so fostered greater empathy and understanding for why he does the things he does, doesn't do the things he does, why he values what he values, why he relates to me the way he relates to me. And so that was so helpful to us relationally as well. So as we just continued to find more and more fruit from it in our lives and the lives of people that we were using our understanding in the Enneagram to help us to really love them better, it was just so fruitful. And then we kept getting asked to speak about it. We never set out, never desired to speak about the Enneagram, to be Enneagram experts, to write about it, but we kept getting asked, and we kept thinking, this is kind of frustrating. This isn't the area we want to speak and write. But it was an acceptance and a surrender to, okay, God, we've seen the power of this tool. It's been personally very helpful in our growth in Christ-likeness. So yes, we will be faithful to say yes, practice saying yes to those who ask of you, like Jesus encourages to, and like he did.
I'm glad you did.
It's been so helpful for people, spiritual direction clients, and in our Soul Shepherding Institute, where we train spiritual directors, and as we're speaking. So pretty early on, as we were using it in ministry, we realized, gosh, we hit the jackpot here, because the Enneagram is a tool of spiritual psychology, and it is so open to a biblical view and a Christ-centered view. And so we bring that in. And since in Soul Shepherding, we're always in this space of integrating Christ-centered spirituality and psychology, this gives us a tool and a model and a system for doing that offers a common language for people. Because if they want to learn more about themselves, there's a lot of information out there that they can use.
Absolutely. Yeah. The way you describe your experience, the mutual empathy, I think Jim and I have come to understand each other better and recognize, oh, that's why you go there. That's why I go there. Okay. That makes better sense now. Before I just didn't like it and didn't make sense, and you weren't like me. Why aren't you like me? So I think at its best, and one of the things I'm hearing is that, the Enneagram helps us grow in our knowledge of God, and it helps us grow in our self-awareness. I wonder if you could just talk a little more about that dual benefit of this sort of tool.
Yeah, well, as you know, Alan, and probably many of your listeners, but, Calvin taught that knowledge of God and knowledge of self go together. And we very much live in that space with our background as therapists and studying psychology for so many years. And so our angle into spirituality and intimacy with God and sanctification and becoming like Jesus is a lot around understanding ourselves and each other and people and humanity, and how God meets us in our brokenness and our sins and our wounds and our strengths and all the things that make up our personalities. And so it is a powerful tool for spiritual growth when we become more aware of our personality. And our angle into this, you might ask the question, well, why write an Enneagram book? There's a few of them out there, even a few Christian ones
out there. A couple, that's true.
And our book takes a unique angle of really diving deep into the emotions of our personality types. And so that's really the angle that we're taking. We feel like the best way to understand personality is through our emotions. And in many ways, our emotions are the window into our soul. We ask each other, how do you feel? And so when you become more aware of your emotions, it helps you go deeper into all the aspects of your being, your needs, your sins, your brokenness, like I was saying before. Also your gifts. And in our relationships, our connections with each other and with God, emotions are a big part of that. And so we did a lot of study into how the core emotions of distress, anger, shame, anxiety, and underlying sadness, those four, there are more core emotions than that, but those four core hurts, we call them, are very definitive and significant in how they affect our personality type. And so each of the 9 types in the Enneagram has a sort of a different experience with those core emotions. And these emotions stack on each other. And what we found is that they're really not well understood by people. And it's when you can find the simplicity and the complexity that's where you come into real wisdom and opportunity for growth. And there's a lot of complexity in how God has created us, and how the Lord redeems us from our sin and our brokenness. And so we don't want to dumb things down. We want to understand that complexity. And then within that, though, when you can see that there is some synergy, some key points that make it simpler, it's really helpful. That's what we found with those 4 core emotions. And so I was amazed as I held this map in my head of these 4 emotions, talking with people, teaching people, training our students, how powerfully helpful it was for me to understand them and communicate their experience. Because when I just used that language, they're like, oh my gosh, how did you know that about me? And so emotions are very helpful for understanding personality, obviously giving each other empathy, and then just growing in a healthier relationship.
Yeah, I remember one of my counselors just said, emotions are God-given energy. They're God-given capacity. And, some of us misdirect them. Some of us pretend they're not there. There's all kinds of things we might do with emotion, but to have them as a way of expressing and experiencing our lives with people, love our neighbor, our life with God, loving God with all our heart and soul and mind and such. I wonder, you listed those you called them 4 hurts in your personality, if I remember the little section title. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about those. You mentioned anger, shame, anxiety, and then that underlying sadness. I maybe even just go a little further about each of those triads of emotion.
Yeah. Well, the Enneagram is helpful in us understanding that based on our number, we are in a triad, and we will wrestle with one of those emotions most primarily based on that triad. So the Enneagram 2, 3, and 4, and I'm starting there because I'm a 2, are the heart types. Yeah. And the heart types, we struggle most in the area of shame. And that's an area where the enemy will really tempt us because we have a lot of vulnerability towards feeling shame. The enemy will really come to try to take us out there with those emotions of shame. Looks a little bit different, the temptation for each of those types, but just recognizing that shame is a form of self-rejection that we each struggle with, and we're each trying in our own, depending upon ourselves, to secure ourselves in our own personality against that rejection, against that shame, that feeling of I am bad, I have no worth. And so as an Enneagram 2, that shame takes the form of I'm wanting to be wanted. And so I often will be overly preoccupied with trying to please people and help people in order to earn love. For the Enneagram 3, it takes a little bit different slant of really trying to perform and achieve to try to earn love because they feel these conditions of worth are necessary in order to secure themselves and to protect against that underlying shame. For the Enneagram 4, it's a little different because they're really looking to be special, wanting to be unique. And so there's great temptation there towards envy other people who are maybe special, and trying to repress emotion in each case, it becomes a real problem. So understanding this can be really helpful for each of the types. We write about it in our book, an emotional alarm for each of the types that can kind of wake us up to when we're trying to secure ourselves, we're depending upon our own resources, our personality, instead of our union with Jesus and our belovedness in Him. And we also give key soul care practices unique to our type that really help us reorient into our union with Christ and trusting Him and getting the love, the help that we need most uniquely based on the area of our sin, our root sin, our woundedness. But it's different then for the head types.
Yeah, and the tricky thing in what Kristi's describing is that we deny that core emotion. So if you're listening and you're a 2, 3, or 4, you might be like, well, I don't struggle with shame because it's probably the emotion you least want to feel. So an example of that, we'll come back to the head type. Yeah. So I'm in the gut triad. And so that's the 8, 9s, and 1s. I'm a 1. And so when we were first learning the Enneagram, Kristi was ahead of me, and she was reading, and she she felt like she knew my type, that I was a one. Now, she was very gentle about it. She didn't judge me, didn't corner me, but she suggested that I was a one, a perfectionist. And so we're reading about it, and I'm going, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm struggling with anger. I this test. And then I listen to myself, and it's like, yeah, thou protesteth too much. There was some anger right there.
Right. Yes.
And so, it took a little while, and I had to get past that denial that, I thought, well, yeah, I struggle with anxiety, but I don't struggle with anger. And then realizing, there is this resentment. It's like the emotion I most don't want to feel. I never want to hurt somebody with anger because I've been hurt with anger. And so I keep all that inside, and then it motivates, I got to be right. I got to do it perfectly. I got to be considerate and all this stuff. So there's this hidden, quiet anger in me, this resentment, and I'm prone to not see it because I so don't want to feel that. And so all the core emotions work that way. And that's so much of the power of the Enneagram is that it's based on this theory of we've got these root sins that are unconscious. So within the gut triad, so the this emotion of anger it's natural. It's like all of our emotions, including these hurts and emotions of distress, like you said, they're God-given, and
Yeah.
anger is a dangerous emotion. All the emotions four are dangerous, and anger can hurt people, and it can certainly lead to sin. But in and of itself, it's an emotion, and so it's at the natural state. It's often a response to broken boundaries. Someone crosses my boundary, crosses my will, and so then I feel angry about that. It's like a signal or an alarm that's like, pay attention here. There's something that you needed that wasn't taken care of, or something that wasn't fair. And so for the eights, the anger is a lot around, they're fighters, and they've got this lust for power because it's not safe for them to be vulnerable. And so they're the type that's more outward with their anger and might be quicker to admit that they have that. And then the nines in the middle of the triad, they are have the most difficulty with admitting that they have any anger. And so they somaticize. Unconsciously, they put anger into their body, and outwardly they're accommodating people, and they're really nice and adaptable. They don't often, sometimes it's hard to tell if someone's really a nine because they seem so, they may like a two, like a heart type, because they're so relational and caring. But that's like the outward self. When you really get to know them, no, there's actually a lot of independence there and directedness, and there's an assertive energy, but it's just kind of trapped in there. They struggle with finding energy and with lethargy. And then the ones, we actually in our book, we call, instead of calling the ones perfectionists, we call them reformers. I felt like, the other eight labels are pretty positive. This one's negative. I don't like that.
Come on.
So I reformed the label. We'll call it reformer. So,
amen.
We ones are about, we give a little description for each of the type to try to really get the synthesis. And for the one, it's everything can be improved. And everyone I've talked to is all about improving things. And so I talked a little bit about how the anger works there with resentment. So it's really, the gut types are independent, strong, and they've got a will. They've got an opinion. They've got an idea how it ought to be, and they don't really want to be messed with. It just comes out in different ways for all three.
Wow, that is so good. Well, Jem and I both find ourselves in the head triad. She describing herself as a 7, and I feel like I'm a very 5, very 5y. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that head center and those types.
Definitely. So the head types, the 5, the 6, and the 7, they struggle most in the area of anxiety. The anxiety looks a little bit different, and they all can be preoccupied in different ways with trying to secure themselves. The 5s, most particularly, with getting more knowledge, more resources as a temptation to secure yourself, to defend against that fear, that underlying fear and anxiety. A fear that gets expressed with maybe not having enough energy or resources being drained from you would be an example. For the 6, the loyalists, they are very preoccupied with security. And often anxiety will take the form of planning for what could go wrong, and a vigilance, a busy brain. For the head types, often is the case, splitting to and fro. The 6s can be excellent problem solvers because of this, but they can really miss relying on Jesus in that, because they can often be so good at having backup plans and safety nets, but that can get their eyes off of Jesus. And like Peter, 6 in the Bible, we believe, who looked down and began to sink. And then for the 7s, the anxiety looks different. It looks like a very much always planning the next fun thing. It's an avoiding the pain and the fear, and it can look very fun and spontaneous, but often it is fueled by this underlying anxiety and trying to avoid that. In all of these cases, whatever the primary emotion is, we want to realize and point to Jesus, that for the head types, Jesus he's your anxiety bearer. He's the one who has perfect empathy for you, whatever expression that fear takes root, that anxiety manifests. For the heart types, the 2, 3s, and 4s, we really focus on Jesus is our shame taker. He's the one who identified with us in our shame, in our sin. On the cross, we see him bearing our sin and our shame, and his empathy for us in our shame and taking our shame. And for the gut types who wrestle most and are broken in the area of anger, Jesus is your anger mediator. He's the one there that we can trust with our anger, that in his anger did not sin, was righteous in his anger, really leads us in that. And so we really look in the Enneagram for every one of these emotions and for each of the types. The face of Jesus is the perfection of each type. He is the perfection of each of the 9 types, and we can each grow in his likeness. But that path might look a little bit different for us based on our unique area of need and brokenness.
Yeah. Well, I think the way you describe that is so helpful, because that's what I found most helpful about the Enneagram. It gave me a way of understanding the frontier where God was inviting me to grow. As a 5 and as a collector of knowledge, and as someone who likes to think about stuff, including my emotions, to know where the point of encounter with God, where healing might happen, where renewal could happen, where transformation could happen. As I've watched some people interact with the Enneagram as it's become rather popular in the church over the last number of years, sometimes it sounds more like a static, like labeling device. Well, I'm a 5. It's in my email footer, right alongside my Myers-Briggs type, and here's my Strength Finders top 5. And so here I am, world. And what you're talking about, what you've done such a good job here, is the dynamic, not a static vision of this tool, but a dynamic vision of this tool. I really appreciate you doing that work. Can you say more about maybe just how this helps us enter into this transforming journey that God's invited us to be on?
Yeah, that's so perceptive, Alan. I love your word, dynamic. The Enneagram is very dynamic, and really that's a way of describing the power of insight and guidance that God gives us through this tool. Because personality, relationships, spirituality are dynamic. They're interactive, complex. Nobody really likes to be boxed. And when you really understand a person, you can't put them in a box. And so the Enneagram really starts with that understanding by saying, well, you're more than your type. You're more than your number. You've got a home number that mostly describes the dynamics that you're dealing with unconsciously and in your personality and how you relate and function and so forth. But you're moving because you've got like a wing on either side of you potentially that's like a subsidiary personality. And then you've got this stress line that's really important to understand. that under stress, you actually take on the characteristics of another number. And then you've got this growth line that you especially need to learn from the healthy side of that other number. So now I've got like maybe 4 or 5 numbers that especially I relate to. And what I love about this is that the Enneagram is predicting how my personality is going to react and move in different situations. And as I become aware of this, as I learn the language of the Enneagram types, and as I learn the language of the emotions that relate to this, now I have options, because what was unconscious, not only my sins and brokenness, but also my gifts and capacities, what was unconscious now becomes conscious. And when it's conscious, I have the power of choice. I can pray about it. I can talk to a friend about it. I can make decisions from that place. And so that is like super helpful to me as a one. Like I've learned that, like as a speaker, if I'm just all in my one, only principles and ideas and trying to improve people, they get a little squirmy, because it's kind of like there's so much energy here around change, and it's a form of intellectual approach here with principles. It can be an overload. But if I find my 7, tell a story, tell a joke, smile, laugh, be spontaneous, or if I find my 2 wing, and I get in that relational space and I say, well, Kristi, what do you think about this? And we have a conversation, or we do, we learn this with you, Alan, in our spiritual formation training from Chuck Miller, but squeeze the sponge. So we always do this, lots of squeeze the sponge in our Soul Shepherding Institute retreats, where we open it up for questions and dialogue for people to say, well, what about this in my life, or in this relationship I have, or in my ministry? And there's so much learning that comes in that dynamic. But if I was just purely in my one, it'd be harder for me to have that fluidity, that flexibility, because I'd be like rigid around the rules and the principles and the right way to do it. So having these Enneagram maps, see, each type has an Enneagram map. We've actually written another book, we self-published a smaller book called Your Enneagram Map, that goes deeper into these dynamics and the relationships between the numbers, because I really feel like if someone thinks they know the Enneagram because they think they know their number, like you were saying, Alan, that's like just the surface of it. Yeah. Because the Enneagram is not really like Myers-Briggs and StrengthsFinder. I mean, a part of it is, but mostly it's getting into this unconscious stuff. This is the psychology side that Kristi and I just love and really emphasize in Soul Shepherding, because now we're given words to that stuff. And so when you learn what your map is, it's like predicting for you what you're going to be tempted by, what you need to remember that you tend to forget, these kinds of things.
Yeah, that is so good. So when I read the chapter about my type, again, the 5, as you talked about those dynamics, I thought about, okay, so that 4 and 6 wing. Yes. Okay. That makes sense. And 6 when I was younger, and now 4 seems even a little more coming into play. And then I think about that 7, when I go stress, my tendency to avoid my anxiety or to numb my anxiety or pretend I'm not anxious. And then the challenge of moving in that direction of the 8, like, that's not how I want to do. My most natural thing is withdraw, and the 8 is going to engage and be assertive and have positive energy in the world. So it was helpful. I think I told you before we hit record, it's funny that my new book, as this airs, it's only been out a few weeks, but A Non-Anxious Life, I wrote it, I guess, because I really do need it, and it's maybe the thing I'm saying is it's been leaning into my anxiety that I'm realizing is such a good growth place for me, where my habit has been to avoid, to numb, to escape, to pretend. So in that sense, I guess I just say thanks for the work you did to remind me of that dynamic.
So good. And really also appreciate you just talking about and modeling in your life this really being intentional to grow in Christ-likeness. And that's really, really what's going to be lasting. We're eternal souls, and our life in Christ is most important. And so that's what we really focused on in Healthy, Fearless, Thriving Faith, was that my favorite part of the book is in each of the type chapters, we talk about Jesus as the healthy type.
Yes.
And my biggest prayer is that people, as they read this book, will just become more and more enthralled with Jesus as they see him, as they read about him as a perfection of each type, and then his empathy for each of us in our types, because it's painful. We feel so trapped in our personality. Like you said, we maybe can sometimes get this vision of growth, but it's hard. It's work. And we've got spiritual battle going on where the enemy knows our weaknesses and continuing to trigger us and try to take us out with his lies. And so to be able to know that Jesus has empathy for us in that, with us in that, and then to be able to have some unique soul care practices that are unique to our type that really can help us to depend upon Jesus, and also a section on how in your personality, as your type, like for instance, Alan, how fives grow to become like Jesus. And one of the things we put in that chapter you're doing here, and that's sharing your knowledge with other people. And that's what you're doing in Unhurried Living so beautifully.
Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. And one of the other things as I looked at your book, and of course you've got these three, well, I think for most of us, distressing emotions: shame, anger, anxiety. But then that idea of that underlying sadness, I just thought that was really, really important. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that dynamic, how that can be underneath some of those emotions that are so central perhaps to our particular type.
Yeah, well, when you learn the language of emotions, not only the emotions of distress, but also the positive emotions, and we are also writing about that, how to unleash the positive emotions: love, joy, peace, power. Of course, those are more than emotions. They're attitudes. There's behavior and relational connections involved there, but they include emotion. And so the awareness of negative or distressing emotions helps us to experience and express and live into the positive emotions. You don't really get the one without the other. And so sadness is an emotion that we tend to not want to feel because it's very vulnerable. It's very close to our heart and to our sense of need and brokenness. And so it's definitely maybe the most likely emotion, but certainly one of the emotions that will hide under the others. And emotions tend to become shy, especially sadness. And so it's hiding behind anger or shame or anxiety and fear, or all three. And so it can be sort of tricky to find that. And what we have found for years in our work as therapists, and then more recently in the recent years as we've been training spiritual directors and functioning in that role, we have found just time and again, as we help people to articulate the hidden sadness that is in a situation, a relationship where there's loss, obvious things when a loved one dies, but all kinds of situations where we feel rejected or have a sense of loss. And when we can articulate that and then receive empathy, it is powerfully healing and releasing of constructive energy.
That's so helpful. I really appreciate that. Well, I wonder if as we close our conversation, if I could ask both of you, maybe just to offer a closing word of encouragement, maybe in the spirit of this book, inviting our listeners in.
Yeah, well, what we just love about each of you who are listening is that you're seeking Jesus as part of your venture to live a unhurried life, which is about being present in the moment to God who loves you and who puts you in loving relationships to other people. And so it's our joy to help you better understand the language of emotions for your personality type, because as you do that, it opens up new portals, new pathways of intimacy with God and with your loved ones and with people that you're helping in your life. And so that's really what we're looking to do for you, is to help you find more language to access through your emotions, the brokenness and the needs, so that you can grow in greater Christ-likeness.
And also just to say that as you do take courage to be more emotionally honest in your relationship with God, and ambassadors of Him, spiritual directors, counselors, spouses, friends, you coaches, you're going to find that you will receive and have a greater ability to receive God's love, his care, and to return to those feelings of joy, peace, and hope in him as you receive his care, his empathy for you in those places of core need and sadness. And as you learn to do and embrace the lament work and the grief work that so often we rush past. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about your ministry, Ellen, and your work is we can't rush past those things. We have to do that work in an unhurried way with the Lord and to make the space and to take the time. It takes time for us. We can't get in touch with our emotions and our pain if we're hurrying through life all the time. Emotions really, we need to slow down in order to open up and create that space to be emotionally honest with ourselves, with God, with an ambassador of Christ to us who can minister to us and can really join and journey with us in that sadness and that grief process. And we see this so beautifully modeled with the psalmist and the Psalms. So often he prays these beautiful, emotionally honest prayers. And then he's able to see him receiving God's care there and connecting with greater intimacy with God. And then how does he, in the Psalms, always return to greater faith and hope and praise to the Lord? And I found that to be so true in my life. And the Enneagram has been something that has been a map that helps me to identify, helps me to go looking and get curious about, okay, where'd that emotion come from? Like, for instance, as a 2, I'll go to the 8 in stress and I'll get angry. And I'm like, okay, why did I just get angry? And I'll look under, because I'm defending against shame. And it's like, where's the shame? What's under that shame? Incredible sadness over the need and the insecurity I feel. And if I can take that to Jesus and I can be honest and I can grieve the loss that came early on for me with an abandonment wound as a baby, because when I was born, the opening of my stomach was closed and I couldn't receive nutrition. I had to have a life-saving emergency that ended me up in the hospital where I experienced great abandonment. And that wound, while I have received incredible amounts of healing, and it's a sacred wound that God uses because I'm a wounded healer, it still is something I carry with me. And I still have to do grief work when that gets triggered by a rejection or by somebody's imperfect love. And to be able to go to Jesus with that honestly, it connects me to him. And we each have a unique story like that. And our Enneagram type will reveal and help us to see where there's greater opportunity for us to grow in intimacy with Jesus and reliance upon him.
Well, thank you, Kristi, Bill. Thanks so much for what you've shared, both in the writing of this book, but also in our conversation. And so again, my guests today have been Bill and Kristi Gaultiere, and we've been talking about their book, Healthy Feelings, Thriving Faith. It's really been a pleasure to have this visit.
Thanks so much, Alan. Really appreciate you and Jen and Unhurried Living and all of you following Jesus with this podcast.
You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.